Well, thank you for having me out. Was I out last year about talking about humor, I think, or was that 2 years ago? I can't remember. Time goes fast. I think Mike was the one who was at a pastoral conference. The pastors are, the Synod is supposed to put a conference on for pastors for learning every fall, and they do. And I think it was a couple years Mike was at one, and the guy next to him looks around and says, "There aren't many of the old guard here." And Mike said, "We are the old guard now." It's hard to believe how fast time goes. It was just a short 33 years ago that I was in my first few months as a pastor, having graduated in 1991 from seminary, and I was what they used to call a pipeliner. Well, I guess we still do, there's just not very many. That is, I went directly from high school to college, and even though I didn't go to a Lutheran college, I did go to a church college, got some religion classes there and some philosophy there. Then went directly to seminary and graduated in 4 years. So at 26, I was ordained a pastor. There's very few folks like that anymore. So I want to talk about it, but some of this, whenever Mike said, talk about how the seminary has changed, and then anytime you have a question, just go ahead and put your hand up. I enjoy being interrupted. So just first of all, okay, this slide, my slideshow is heavy on statistics, which are not interesting, but it's better than my normal slideshows, which are all just Bible words. So this is the head count at Luther Seminary. So I started teaching at Luther Seminary in 2003, and you can see we had over 750 students. Now, not all of them were part-time, but many of them were full-time students. Full-time students takes, a true full-time student takes 4 classes a term, but you count as full-time if you take 2 or 3. So we started to grow. I think that's because they hired me in 2003. We grew for about 4 years, and then people realized maybe we should be and we had a new president, and his goal was to get us to 1,000 students. And he was forced to step down right about this year here. We still had 750 students, but we had huge money problems. And then we got the new world. And you can see now we are around 380 students, many of them part-time, and various degrees, but the bulk of our students are still MA and MDiv. That is two-year or 4-year degree students who are preparing for ministry. But here, notice this. At the same time, this has been happening. 1988, the ELCA reported over 1.6 million people were in worship weekly. And now it's 400,000. Right? It's a fourth. Somebody's good at the math.
Yeah, thank you.
Right? Down 75% over the course of my ministry. And lots of things are going on there. But the main thing that's going on is the change in religious involvement across all religions in America. That is, people participating in formal religion, organized religion that we call it, right? The dominant form, of course, has been church, but also the synagogue, the mosque. In the first or second generation after immigration, stays strong, but already then third generation starting, same thing is happening in Islam, in our Muslim countries. Here was the shocking thing a year ago to me. I think it was a year. Judaism does not have formal denominations like Christianity in America, but they have informal denominations. Reform Judaism, conservative Judaism. Reform Judaism started as a movement in Cincinnati. And the first Jewish Reform Seminary was in Cincinnati. They have closed their Cincinnati rabbinical campus. So, right, they no longer have a rabbinical seminary. residential in Cincinnati. They've moved and they have some others open like in Los Angeles. But, so this is the decline in religious participation in America is the reality around us. Now, one of the things my church history colleagues tell me is, 50 years is journalism, not history. And one of the things we have to realize we're coming off of as the church, especially in North America, is following World War II, the church had the most successful period it ever had, ever. Religious participation in America in the 50s and 60s was stronger and more vibrant than at any other time in church's history. So at the time of the founding of the country, only 5% of Americans belonged to the church, a church. So as we compare ourselves to what we grew up with, I was born in 65, we have to realize that we were born in the most successful time for the church in any culture. I think that's a helpful reminder. This is a slide about America's changing landscape that I don't think is very helpful. So this is a set of slides that some friends of mine and I have made. Right, it just shows it's all right. Mostly, the most interesting thing, unfortunately, is the main line. Right, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Methodist. Right, that 30%. We were at 30% back in 1970. And now down to like 12%. So all the mainline churches especially, but again, we had the most successful period. This is a slide that just shows the church's aging. I didn't need a slide. Look around. Look at us. Mike's the youngest guy here. Well, Connie's younger than Mike. Well, and then we got, Connie's younger than Mike. The church is aging. So there's now then what we call at Luther Seminary the mixed ecology in churches. So churches used to be very common and they all look the same for the most part. I was born in Jackson, Minnesota. Who's been to Jackson, Minnesota? Who was born in a town like Jackson, Minnesota? Right?
Wyndham.
You were born in Wyndham. American Lutheran Church?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great church. I'd go live there anytime. So my dad, when he graduated from seminary, Jackson was not his first call, but let's pretend it was. The last pastor had left, and so they call a new pastor, and the seminary's job was to train replacement pastors. There was an opening. They got a house the pastor can live in. They got an office for the pastor and his or her books. And at that time it was still his. And they got a sanctuary, and every church in the denomination had the same hymnal. Remember the red hymnal from 58? And there were something like 2 settings of the liturgy in there. You didn't have 12 or whatever it is now, and it's so and so you were a replacement pastor. And then when they even, they had an office, a church, an education space, and everybody taught the small catechism in the education space. You see, the system, it was a system. Well, that all started breaking down, got much, much more complicated. How many worship services we have here? 4. Do they all use the same liturgy every week? No. So now the pastor, how many liturgies? 2. 2. That's not bad. 2. Not too complicated, But the pastor now has to learn, there's 11 liturgies in there, plus any church of any size probably has a rock service or a country service, something completely less liturgical, if you know what I mean. And much more complicated than that, there are churches that no longer can attract a pastor, and towns that want to have their church, but they can't attract or pay. Mostly it's an issue of attracting a pastor. Almost all pastors that I know who are married If they're married, their spouse is working too, and very probably that spouse can't move. And maybe that spouse even owns a business that can never be moved, like a farm. One of my recent students, Jamie Decker from Gwinner, North Dakota, her husband is a farmer. Can't move a farm. And if you could, you wouldn't move it out of the Red River Valley in North Dakota, right? The best farmland in the world, unless it's Jackson, Minnesota. So the reality is then you have these churches, so they've realized instead of fighting a losing battle, trying to attract somebody who doesn't know Gwinner, North Dakota, doesn't want to live there for very long, and even if they come, they'll leave in 3 years, they just said, hey, Jamie, why don't you go to seminary? And Jamie was 40 years old or so when she started, and she's now graduated, and she's the pastor at Gustavus Adolphus Lutheran Church. Isn't that a great name for a church, right? God save us, all of us, if you say it really fast. And so that's a new model. Instead of trying to find a pastor, they find a pastor in their midst and say, go to seminary. So Jamie came, and she started off as what's called a SAM, a synodically authorized minister. That is, we just need somebody who could preach and lead the liturgy. Jamie, would you do that? So she goes and she takes a couple courses on lay preaching, and she starts to do it, and she finds she likes it, and the church says, you're good at this. So eventually, then she came. So there's churches that are a traditional church, but they're now small, and they're led by at first a non-credentialed person. That is non-ordained. But then there's all sorts of other new forms of church popping up. There's digital churches, people who are part of a church just online, but it meets their needs. Maybe they're homebound, or maybe they just don't like people. Micro churches, house churches, small churches, churches that meet in a restaurant or a coffee shop or a bar. And they set up, I've got one student who's a pastor, well, she's a seminary student, she's not a pastor, in Florida, and they don't even meet the same place every week. They move around, kind of from restaurant to coffee shop to bar. Interesting place. And she mostly shepherds people who've been hurt by the church, and so they don't want to going into a traditional building somehow threatens triggers their past experience, and so they don't ever want to have a building in these places, but of course they're always going to be barely on the margin of survival. Something called fresh expressions, which is forms of church that are really built around common interests like bicycling or hiking or outdoor things. And part of the new ecology of the church is also megachurches. Starting in the 60s, really, 50s maybe, our high school started getting really big. How big was your high school class? How many kids, roughly? 48? 698. Where were we? 600? Anoka. But 698 started getting big. What year? 78. 78. Mine was 721 in Anoka. Right, so it started getting big. But before then, you would have had a couple smaller high schools. The best place I lived growing up was Roseville, Minnesota. I loved Roseville. Unfortunately, I graduated from high school in Northfield, but don't tell anybody. Roseville had two high schools. It had Alexander Ramsey and Kellogg on the west and the east side. You went to Kellogg? I think I would have been the last class of Ramsey, or the second to last, if we hadn't moved. But in about 84, what year did they combined them? So you had one high school that was bigger. Edina used to have two. Now they only have Edina. Bloomington had 3 high schools. And we started combining, both because population was going down, but also because Americans were getting much more comfortable with really big institutions where you didn't have to know anybody. Our malls got bigger, right? So Southdale was the first mall in the country, and then pretty soon, malls everywhere, big malls, Mall of America. And churches got bigger. So you ended up with mega churches, which Zion might be right on the precipice. How many folks in worship here?
550.
550. So usually, doesn't matter. It's not about being a mega church, but our biggest churches are getting bigger. So Mount Olivet is once again the biggest church in the ELCA because the biggest church in the ELCA got kicked out in September. Hope, something like 18,000 members at Hope in Iowa. Hope in West Des Moines, but they got so many satellite locations, I think they're just Iowa now. But it's like an interesting thing happens then is, so you're getting really big churches, a few of them, and then you're getting a lot of little churches, who are led by lay people, and then you're getting some traditional churches, right? So we call that the mixed ecology at Luther Seminary. So instead of doing one thing, this is where I'm going with the story, instead of doing one thing at Luther Seminary, training replacement pastors for churches in our own denomination, we are now training leaders for the whole thing. I'm going to skip ahead. Here, this is the best slide to explain what we're doing. So, from the bottom, can you see this at all? At the bottom, this is a big cone. It's the cone of silence, except it's reversed. So, 370 students in our degree programs. I think it's actually 380 some. These are students who are MDiv, MA, PhD, and one of the most interesting things about those students is they're now, when we were students, it was 100% residential. Everything was taught in person. Now we're 70% distributed learners. So students who take courses online, and those courses might be totally what we call asynchronous. So you're not ever in real time with the professor. The professor might put up a couple videos a week, and there's reading, and then you have to respond, and then you're in a group responding to each other by typing usually. We also do have classes based in Zoom like this, where I might have people like you who are in the room, but a camera like that and a screen where I can see the people that are zooming in from all over the United States. And one woman is zoomed into a class I had this fall from Botswana, which is next to South Africa. I didn't know exactly where it was. I couldn't have identified it from its shape. There's a new trivia game that shows you the shape of a country. I don't know what Botswana looks like, right? Probably looks a lot like Ohio. I don't know. These students are all far less Lutheran. Lutherans still are the majority, but we also have many global students. 40 international students live on our campus. The biggest change is we probably have about 60 students on campus, 40 international students, and 20 American students. Then we also, we teach learning communities, which there might be 12 people from a church and 12 people from another church that are studying one thing in particular. Synchronous learning, what this really means, synchronous learning really means conferences. So we own at Luther Seminary the Festival of Homiletics, for example, which is a festival, a learning experience for pastors. It's during the Easter season when they're tired, and then they can go and study preaching for a few days. This year it's in Atlanta. Last year it was Pittsburgh. This year it's in Atlanta. Asynchronous learning and websites and podcasts, 7.5 million, right? So you see this is not, the cone is not to scale because 370 versus really 8 million. We own a couple websites at Luther Seminary that are groundbreaking websites, one of which is called Working Preacher. Have you ever heard of Working Preacher? Who's heard of Working Preacher? All right, the preachers have. But it's not just preachers that go there now. So a lot of lay people, and the two main things we have in Working Preacher are weekly columns on the texts. So 1,000-word study of, if you're in the Revised Common Lectionary, the 4 texts of the week, the Gospel, the first lesson, the Psalm, and the second lesson. Each will get a 1,000-word column study of it, written by someone with a PhD in biblical studies. And then the narrative lectionary, which is 1 text every week, and the columns again, 1,000 words. And then we have a column in Spanish that's just on the gospel for Spanish-speaking churches. And I had 8 million people, 8 million different users a year. Some of those users are one-time users. Maybe they're interested in Psalm 39 or something, or they have to write a college paper. Fewer and fewer of those around on, Mark 12 or something. They Google it, they find Working Preacher, they find an understandable article, 1,000 words long, that teaches them something that they can either use in their assignment, or maybe they're leading a Bible study at their church. We also have weekly podcasts. Our 2 main podcasts are called Sermon Brainwave, which is a podcast on the Revised Common Lectionary text of the week. I was on that for about 12 years. Then I stepped away to serve as academic dean, but the woman who replaced me has left Luther Seminary as of 2 weeks ago today. And so I'm back on they had to it's like the commercial where they pull a backup quarterback to back in the car, the trailer, or hang the picture. If you've seen those pictures, they pulled me out of the bullpen for a few months. Yeah, she's the president of a seminary. Pays more.
All the time too. I listen to the podcast. I listen to old ones just to kind of keep me going. I read the commentary, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So think about, especially the lay preacher in some small town, that church doesn't want to shut. The 50 people that go there love it, and they're going to keep going. They don't care if they're small, but they need somebody to lead them, and so we are educating them through Working Preacher. 8 million, and we have a website called Enter the Bible, that if you type up any biblical term in English, it's the #1 site that gets directed. You type in Joshua, or you type in covenant, or some biblical word, we're the #1 site. And we actually need to beef up the definitions because they're too small. They were designed to be 2 sentences long.
Did you call it Enter?
Enter the Bible. And let me see, if I do this, nope, okay. All right. I'm going to stop there for a minute just to say, so how the seminary is, we believe, I don't know if you know this, our church teaches, whether we believe it or not, it's a different question. Our church teaches that the local church will always exist because God will sustain it. And that is what's called a dogma of the faith, which is a dogma is like a doctrine except more so. So a basic dogma is that the church will always exist, and it will exist in its local form. Christians gathering together in the name of Jesus to pray and praise and read Scripture together. The question for us is, what are the shapes in the territory God has told us to help educate leaders? That's our job. Who are those leaders, and how will we educate them? They're not all just 22-year-olds like I was in 1987. Very few are. So our student body mirrors the church. Our student body is much older than when I was a student. It's much more part-time. It's much more distance learning. By the way, do you guys know about a principle called the principle of unintended consequences? This is why some of us are philosophically conservative. Because we believe that when somebody initiates a change, there will be an unintended consequence they haven't thought of, and it will probably be worse than whatever they achieve. And when I have introduced major changes as a leader in the church, there's always been an unintended consequence that I didn't foresee. So in the 90s, when we started our distance education, we were the leader at Luther Seminary. I was not there yet, but we had a couple professors who were the leaders, started distance education. Here's the unintended consequence. Oh, I don't have to move there? I won't. Oh, now our dorms are empty, right? But the positive still outweighs the negative on that, because people who could never be trained for leadership in the church now can be. And if it means we have to sell our dorms, then we'll sell our dorms, right? And if it means our whole campus has to be rethought, which it does, we're rethinking it. So, other questions?
Back when we were at SAM, and I mentioned this in the announcement and in kind of the introduction, you know, it was a bustling community.
Yep.
Sitting down at lunch with your colleagues, with professors, was as
Yep.
much part of the learning growing experience as I suspect that's happening, but in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, you all know from whatever education you did, or whatever part of the, if you were in the military, that half of what you do is related, half of the growth is coursework, and half of it's not. What they call extra or co-curricular experiences, especially sitting in the cafeteria and arguing, being up late at night, maybe having a group study. Students find their ways to do that, but we have four intensive weeks a year where people do come to campus. We do require students to come to campus for a minimum number of courses, and it depends which degree you're on, how that works. But those are the most important parts where students get those sorts of experiences. And then they form online working groups. Here, I want to talk about a couple other things that have changed in seminary education. The first is debt. Debt has gone way down. So this is the average graduate student loan debt at Luther Seminary. So in 1517, if a student had debt, and a lot of our students had no student loan debt, the average was about $60,000. So you'd come maybe right out of college. That's another big change. I think a lot of reasons we don't get 22-year-olds coming out of college is they can't afford it. So F17 means fiscal 17, July to June. And then we quit charging tuition. Well, it's not quite true. What we do is we just 100% scholarship, all tuition. So it's still technically charged. Students just don't pay for it themselves. And now, because of that, in fiscal 24, the average student with debt, and remember, if they had no debt, they don't count here, that's down to under 50. And so you're asking yourself, well, if it's free, why do they have any debt, right? Students have to take out debt to pay for life while they're a student. That's the number one thing we learned in the early 2000s. So back in the day, when I was in college, I was able to graduate from college with $3,500 of debt for 4 years. In part because a summer job plus a part-time job could mostly pay for college with family help. Do you remember those days? Maybe you had kids or nieces or nephews in college. Tuition, everything was under $20,000, so you could maybe make $4,000 in a summer, working a job or two, and then have a part-time job, and then mom or dad could help, and then maybe you took out $1,000 in student loans, and you could get through, if you were thrifty, with not much debt. We found out that in seminary, students were really taking out student loans to live, even when our students were on internship. So back in the day, you went for 2 years, then you went for a 12-month internship. I went to Mount Vernon, Washington, north of Seattle. Drove out there, spent 12 months, drove back. The pay was $600 a month plus an apartment. Out of that $600, $217 car payment. So now I'm down to, what am I down to, $370 or something? Then I had to pay taxes on the apartment. So I was down to like $500 a month to live. Student, I lived. Poorest year of my life, but really the best year maybe. Because people at the church would say, we need to have you out to, intern, we need to have you out to dinner sometime. And I would say, I'm free Tuesday and Thursday. Because I was like, first of all, alone. Second of all, I was like, I had no money. We found out in 2005 when we studied this that students on internship were taking out the max amount of student loans. Because they weren't necessarily single, and whatever the church at that time was paying, I think, $1,000 a month plus an apartment, and that's not enough to live on. So we started giving, this is a really positive change. And here then is the actual total student borrowing at Luther Seminary. In fiscal 17, all of our students were together were 2.2 million. Now, less than $500,000. And that's all just to live. Make sense? Last thing, what we teach has had to change because our students are changing. Our students, of course, come to us, many of them less knowledgeable about Christianity than they were in past generations. If you had gone to church college and had some Bible, and maybe you just grew up in a family that did devotions every night. Makes me nervous. We have a really interesting experiment. A friend of mine and I teach the intro class called Christian Public Leader. And at the midterm, they have to interview two people who are not Christian and ask, what do you know and believe about God? What do you know and believe about the Christian Bible? And what do you know and believe about the Christian church? Everyone in the class, and there's 90 students, they have to interview two people. Some get excited by it and start interviewing like 6 because it's fun. And they interview people from around the world. They interview local people, college or high school friends who aren't Christian, or some are, our incoming students from Africa and from India and from Indonesia. They, through Zoom, interview somebody back home. So one of the, here's the range of answers that we got. And then they have to integrate those along with everything we've been reading and talking about in class into a paper about why God, why Bible, why church. These are the questions we need to be asking. So if your pastors, if you go up to them and say, why should I believe in the Christian God? They ought to have an answer ready. Right? You mean, our students are like, you mean I'm supposed to be able to answer that question? Yeah. And a beginning answer. So they interview atheists, they interview Muslims, they interview basically pagans. One of the students from abroad, a student said, well, this is the time of year where we beg for forgiveness, and we bathe in blood, and we sacrifice an animal, and we beg the gods for forgiveness. Right? Another student said, interviewed an American atheist who said, what's up with your effing God? who you say thinks he knows everything I'm going to do. That's the range of context that our students have to be able to say, here's why the Christian God is the God that I believe in and follow. Same with the Bible. Why is the Bible a trustworthy revelation of who God is and what God wants for our lives? The answer that would have been very comfortable growing up in an insulated Christian community when I was a kid, the main argument would have been, are you Lutheran or are you Catholic? Because almost all the kids were, one or the other in Northfield, Minnesota. If your name ended in Czech, you were a Catholic. The Mahacheks had like 2 pages in our high school yearbook. If your name ended in Son, you were probably related to St. Olaf College somehow. Why the Bible? Especially what bothers people is that there are contradictions in the Bible. Because people that are American empiricists think the only kind of truth is the kind of truth that is incontrovertible, provable, and is never wrong. And so you have in the Bible, you have contradictions. And by the way, yes, there are contradictions in the Bible, because the Bible as a revelation of truth was never about an American empiricist view of truth, but somehow we got sucked into it. And so in America, starting in the 18th century or 19th century, people started saying, no, the Bible is inerrant, without error. And why, why the church, sorry, Tepo, why the church? A lot of people who have been hurt by the church, or someone they know has been hurt by the church, don't know, even when they believe in God, even when they believe in the Christian God, no longer want to be involved in church. So how can we be the type of community that wraps its arm around people the way Mike and I both experienced the church wrapping its arms around us when we each had cancer separately? Mike's cancer was 2022. Mine started in 1980. And the way the church was a great community, how can we be that instead of, and doing less of being a church where people get hurt? They're always going to be hurt. People will always be hurt because we're all sinners. But how can we be a type of church? Finally, this. Here's what all graduates of all seminaries in every tradition in America said, what they need the most to learn. The first thing is spiritual, I would say practices. The article that I'm citing calls them spiritual disciplines. It used to be that you could assume a student came to seminary with pretty good spiritual habits. They knew how to pray. They knew how to read the Bible, a little at least. They probably knew the liturgy, which is full of spiritual practices, right? If you think about the liturgy is basically all of the spiritual practices we can do at church. It doesn't have service, maybe it doesn't have evangelism, but it has everything else, gratitude, Bible, singing, praying, lamenting, blessing, reconciling when we pass the peace, and so on, right? Now our students are saying this is the number one thing we need, we don't have. If someone were to say to you, I want you to help me follow Jesus. A friend of mine who started a church, a Baptist church called Mill City Church in Minneapolis, in order to be a member, you must be actively discipling another person. Now think about that. Now, if you got kids, you go, my kids, right? Okay, I'm covered. But are you actually actively discipling them? Where would you start? If somebody said, I want to follow Jesus, today, where would you start? There ought to be a smart aleck response right now. Well, I'd tell them to go to working preacher. Not really. What would you do? Help me follow Jesus today.
Invite them?
Where? You invite them? Well, that's a place. Okay, I'd like you to start coming to church with me. I'll meet you. I'll take you. You'll sit with me. I'll help guide you through, right? But how about this? Are you praying before meals? No. Okay, I'm going to write down a prayer for you to say before meals. And then we're going to meet every 2 weeks. And that's like prayer. If somebody's not praying, to me, a simple place is prayer before meals. I think at my lowest point of spiritual involvement in life, freshman year in college probably, I was still praying before meals in the cafeteria, silently, because I'd been taught to pray before meals, right? So where do you start actively discipling someone to follow Jesus? Invite them into a Christian experience somehow, and teach them basic spiritual practices. I would start with prayer. Oh, if they say yes, I'm already praying before meals. Okay, do you pray either at the start or at the end of the day? When is your main prayer time? Do you have a devotional? By the way, we at Luther Seminary send out a daily devotional that's free. It's called God Pause, Pause, not the animal kind. And sign up for it. It comes in your email at 7 o'clock in the morning, and a lot of people start their day with God Pause. It's short. I think it's less than 100 words. So you read scripture, and then the devotional is supposed to be about 100 words. And it's short, and a prayer. Preaching, of course. Pastors need interpersonal skills, job skills, administration, pastoral care. Here's an interesting one. Listening. Listening. Pastors, learn how to talk, right? We're good at talking. And then, do you learn to listen? I think in an age of social media and phones and always having things, people need to learn how to listen deeply to each other. All right, I'm going to stop there.
Number 9,
Yep.
and other duties as necessary. You know?
Well, there's 20 actually. Here's the rest. Interpersonal competency, I don't know, that came up twice, I don't know why. Intrapersonal. Education, communication, theology, Bible, finance, facilitation, intercultural, conflict resolution, organizational politics, difficult conversations, and formation. That's the top 20.
Did you notice it's not music and singing and chanting? Just saying, just saying.
Well, what's interesting there is worship leadership is not listed, which is odd. Very odd. There's the list also, new skills, technology. New skills they had to learn in the last year. Technology, liturgics, and workshop is there. That's interesting.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Before our time.
Oh, when I do this, you can't see it. When I'm flipping screens, and you go ahead.
My question is, when you said that this percentage lives on campus, this percentage you're doing online and that, Zion has been the benefactor
Yeah.
of networking because our pastors have known each other in the seminary.
Right.
Where will that come from? Not just a few times you can meet, could you say,
Yep.
Mike is a great guy, let's see what he does.
Yep. So some of that still happens, of course, through. Let me tell you. You got time? I'm kind of known for my pointless stories that actually have a point. So I had a group of students, an online cohort. They went through seminary together in 2 years. They went year round. They worked in churches at the same time. And in cohort 3, we had 3 cohorts of this that did this. There was a group of students who would then meet and become friends. I mean, they'd come to campus right? 30 students together. And then there were groups within it who became, friends. A little bit cliquish, that one, but there was one group, and they had somebody in California, somebody in Minnesota, somebody in Ohio, and 2 others. I can't remember where they lived. 5 students that would study together weekly, online. And one of them didn't want to take a course from a certain professor. And he came to me and said, you're taking this, which all of them were signed up to do together because they all took their courses together. And he said, you're teaching it this semester. Can I take it with you? And I said, sure. So his name was Sean. And he was taking the class with me. And 2/3 of the way from the semester, the other 4 people in the group found out he hadn't told them. And then the student who was organizing it online, I'm going to say a slightly off-color word because it was in her thing. She said she put the name of the meeting on their calendar that week was called Betrayal. And the password to get in, the guy who took it, Sean, took it with me. You had to type in, the password was Shit Talk Sean. So I took this as a sign of health, right? You have people who love each other, it's okay to get mad. The one didn't tell us, but we're going to give you a really hard time about it. And those people are really tight, really good. So it still happens. It's just different. And I think it's really important that for pastors, and this happens less in the Twin Cities, so the pastors to get to know the other pastors in their conference, in their synod, and go to things. It's more likely in the Twin Cities that people don't get involved because there's so many other forms of community here that when you're out in Jackson, Minnesota, where I was, where my dad is pastor, it's more likely to get involved. So support your pastors to be involved in synodical things, to take the time off. It's not time off from work when they go to the Synod Convention, when they go to the Synod Pastoral Conference and meetings. It's important work for Zion. It's a good question. Other questions? What's the first thing, if somebody said, I want to follow Jesus, what's the first thing you would have them read? If they said, is there a book or something I could read? What's the first thing you'd have them read?
Gospel of Mark.
Gospel of Mark? Gospel of John? Romans? That might be a little hard for a newcomer, but yeah. What is the righteousness of God? Good question, though. Good answer. How about non-biblically? If they said, is there a non-biblical thing for me to read? Now, by the way, a friend of mine named Tim, not a pastor, but he loves Jesus. First thing he does when he wakes up, before he gets out of bed in the morning, is he gives thanks, and then he asks God to give him one person that he can talk about Jesus with that day. And he says almost every day there's a chance for him to talk in his business. Just in his life. He's a businessman, about Jesus. Sometimes the person is already a believer. Sometimes they're not. I think I sometimes miss opportunities to talk to people about Jesus because I'm not looking for them.
Orange car.
The orange car. You remember the orange car thing, right? That's look for the Holy Spirit in your neighborhood at work. Sometimes it's like an orange car, which is you think you haven't seen an orange car, and then you start looking for them and you see them. So start looking for someone to talk to about Jesus or the Holy Spirit at work in your neighborhood. Hey, it's 5 to 11. I said I'd wrap up early. Thanks for having me here. Thanks for being interested in the work of the seminary.